So today we finished putting together the full text of the Elephant Path book for children. So that's Michelle's doing. She's the senior author, and it's a great book. We got 4 different sets of methods for 4 different age groups. And the methods are divided by developmental age. So the book is now in draft form. We're going to pass off on the changes that we made and then go off to the copy editor in another couple of weeks. So hopefully it'll be out soon enough. You want to say anything about it? Michelle is our resident child teacher.
Oh gosh. I just wanted to thank you for your incredible patience and support and cracking the whip.
I didn't tell you that it sucked, did I?
No. So.
Yeah, you did it. So it's going to be an important book for kids. And we included in all the research on distracting web involvement and internet involvement and mobile devices and all this other stuff that this generation is involved with, all the research on that. So it's updated. It's all in one place. Anything you want to know about distracted attention, where are the authorities on it? Not good attention, just distracted attention. So it's good. Thank you for all your work. So we have new people here tonight for the first time? No? Hi, what's your name? Hi, Jenny, welcome. Do you have some sort of spiritual practice that you're involved in?
Not a regular one, no.
How about an irregular one?
Yeah.
What do you do?
I think about it a lot.
Some people would say that thinking is not a spiritual practice.
I know. No, I actually just recently started practicing meditation about 6 months ago over at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center.
Mindfulness. Yeah.
So I've read a little bit about Buddhism from there, but that's it so far.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you.
Anybody else new? Okay. So what we do is, this is meditation improv. We leave it open-ended for whatever you discuss about questions you raise about spiritual practice in everyday life or about meditation practice specifically. And then based on the nature of the discussion in the second half of the course, we translate it into some meditation that illustrates what we're doing. So open for whatever you want. Doug?
I saw the paper that's published. It's very impressive. And
Or the one on the Neuros-Circuitos for awakening?
The one from the UMass study, you know, yes. And I wonder
What
if
he's
you could do
referring
some
to is
translating.
What's that?
I wonder if you could do some translating, because
Okay.
it's very dense.
You have to understand your neuroscience. The context of this was that in the basic retreats, as you know, we give specific lineage teachings that are very explicit, and the goal is to use the course to shift your basis of operation from ordinary mind to awakened mind. So we say the confluence of all the teachings, the heart essence of all 84,000 teachings, is the common factor is the experience of awakened mind as opposed to ordinary mind. So if you have that realization, however short it may be, then you have the heart essence of all these teachings. So I was increasingly dismayed by the fact that their meditation is becoming so popular in Western culture, but rarely do teachers of meditation of one sort or another ever mention awakening. Why are we doing it? That's the purpose of doing it. So we had a serendipitous occasion where one of my students was a postdoc in neuroscience in Berkeley, and he moved to MIT to do another postdoc in neuroscience, and one of the labs that he worked part-time in was Judd Brewer's lab, which is a neuroscience lab devoted entirely to research on mindfulness. So, and Judd has done a lot of studies on the neurocircuitry of mindfulness meditation. But his postdoc convinced him to take this course. And in the same course, one of the members of the Fetzer Foundation family took the course, Bruce Fetzer. So about halfway through the course, I had lunch with both of them and said, why don't you stop studying mindfulness as a technique and study the heart of this, which is awakening. No one's ever talks about awakening anymore. And if you can, if you're open to that, then I'll deliver you subjects who have awakening part of the time, but not all of the time. So you can scan them in the ordinary waking mind, distracted waking mind, and you can scan them when they're awakened and see if you can get identification of specific neurocircuitry markers or regions of interest that mark awakening. So they were convinced, and Fetzer Foundation put up the money for a project on that. And we started with 40 subjects. We ran 30. And the way we did this, first we did the subjects by teacher nomination. John Churchill and myself both identified students that we thought, well, since there was a limited budget, so we tried to take local students who had awakening and run them as subjects. And John and I independently, because some of the subjects were John's subjects, and some of them were my subjects, and some of them were Gretchen's students, and some of them were George's students, but most of them were local, so that didn't involve George that much. And we decided that we would develop rating scales on a 1 to 10 scale. So we rated the clarity and the description of 4 states: ocean and waves practice, timeless, boundless ocean-like awareness, and their descriptions of that state. Then second was the refinement of that as the natural state. The natural state is a non-dual field of awareness without vast, infinite awareness without inside and without outside, with automatic emptiness of whatever arises within that state. And everything, all instances of doing are immediately empty upon arising, so it's simple and free of doing. All conceptualization tendencies are immediately empty upon arising, so it's fresh and free of conceptualization. And because it's free of conceptualization, it has a kind of obvious or transparent lucidity of awakened awareness, rather. So those are the 5 conditions of the natural state, which is the platform state or the foundation for awakening. So that was the second state. The third state was lion's gaze, the crossing over instructions for awakening, where you take the view of the infinite, vast, expansive awakening, the field of limitless awareness space. And you orient the awareness not towards anything specific in the field, but towards the entire field, like the gaze of the lion or the child viewing a temple, taking everything all at once. So those were the 3 conditions: ocean and waves, natural state, and lion's gaze. And the 4th was stable awakening. We had the subjects report when they were in stable awakening. And we contrasted those 4 meditation conditions to ordinary distracted state. And then we measured the students with a 128 channel EEG. We didn't use functional MRI because MRI doesn't give real-time reporting. And we thought that we needed to say when if the student did a meditation, we needed for them to be able to say, now I'm in awakening. I've shifted my basis to awakening and stable. And so at that point, we could start looking at what the neurocircuitry was activated or deactivated. So we ended up running, of the 40 subjects that we rated, we both rated the subjects independently on a 1 to 10 scale for each of those. And the criterion was they had to score 6 or higher on the 10-point scale for all 4 of those meditation states, including awakening, by both raters, both teachers. And there were 3 students that we disagreed on, so we eliminated them. because we couldn't tell whether the awakening was conceptual or not. But the other 37 subjects were viable subjects that we had, I think, 80% accuracy, agreeing, John and I independently rating the subjects. We had 80% accuracy of knowing that the students were in that state. We both said the same thing. Then some of the students we didn't run because they couldn't do it with their schedule or because they were too far away, but we ran 30 of the 40 original subjects. One, the EEG cap was defective that day. They couldn't get it to work right, so we had to eliminate one subject because the technology was defective. But we ran 29 subjects, and we ran them for an hour, so that the first thing they did is 10 minutes of a baseline in their ordinary thinking distracted state. Then there were 10 minutes of ocean and waves, and it was a guided meditation. All they have to do is put the EEG cap on and listen to the instructions and follow the instructions like pointing out style. And then 5 minutes of talking about that. Then 10 minutes of natural state and 5 minutes of talking about that. Then 10 minutes of lion's gaze and 5 minutes of talking about that. And then a stable awakened awareness whenever they had it, and then talking about that. So there were 3 sets of findings. The first finding was that relative to the ordinary waking state, ordinary distracted mind, not in that state and not in the stable awakening, but in the other 3 meditation conditions, which are ocean and waves, natural state, which is automatic emptiness, and lion's gaze. One of the striking findings was that the anterior cingulate cortex was heavily activated in all 29 subjects. And ACC activation is the anterior cingulate cortex is the attention center of the brain. So it's used when there are competing attention demands. So in way we study that in psychology is with something like a Stroop test. If I show you an index card and the text says green, the word green, but the color of the text is in red, you do a double take. Do you focus on the text or do you focus on the color? So it takes effort to tune out the text to focus on the color, or to tune out the color to focus on the text. And when you give people tasks that involve standardized competing attention demands like that, you usually see an activation of the ACC. The ACC is that area of the brain that's underactive in children and adults who have attention deficit disorder. So, in the 3 meditation states, not the awakened state, but in the 3 meditation states, the students all were activating intense concentration. But the unusual part of the finding, which is very rare, was if you look at the frequency or the amplitude of the activation, it was in the gamma range. Usually we think of fast, normal, alert brain activity as beta activity. And then when you get more resting and relaxed, it's alpha activity. It's more slow activity. When you get into reverie and daydreamy states, that's more slow activity called theta activity. And when you're deep asleep, it's beta activity, which is, delta activity, which is the slowest of all. So this is in the other direction, which is very rare. So what you're seeing is high frequency activation. And there are 2 gamma widths. There's gamma 1 and gamma 2. This is gamma 1, which was 65 to 45 hertz. So the only interpretation of that is that this area of this region of interest, the anterior cingulate cortex, is not only becoming activated, but all the cells are activated and synchronized, which is a very rare finding. It's hardly ever found in anything. It usually means that all the cells are firing at the same time in a coordinated and synchronized way. It's a very rare finding. We interpret that as that in all 3 of those meditation conditions, holding the view of ocean-like changeless boundless awareness, holding the view of the natural state, and holding the immense limitlessness of an awakened, of lion's gaze, which leads to awakening. Those 3 views take a certain intensity of holding the view. The view is the meditation. The view is the meditation. So we interpreted those findings as meaning that it took a lot of work for the subjects in terms of certain regions of brain activity to tune everything else out and just hold the view with nothing else interfering with it, and to hold it in a sustained way. That was the first major finding. The second major finding was more important in some ways, because we found that during the awakened condition, but not in the 3 meditation conditions and not in the waking distracted condition, ordinary distracted condition, only in the awakened, stable awakened condition, we found activation in the parietal area. And it's a specific area of the parietal area that has to do with perspective taking and shifting from local to global awareness. So let's take the opposite of that. Let's say we have a trauma patient who has non-epileptic seizures and they're writhing all over the floor and they're completely out of it for 3 or 4 minutes and they don't even know that they're writhing. The EEG of that shows the deactivation of that area of the brain that changes from local to global awareness. They have no global awareness. They're not even awareness of anything in their surroundings. They're just completely writhing. And of course, deactivation of motor control systems. But here we're finding the opposite of something like that, the positive opposite of that, where you're shifting from normal localized awareness to something huge, which is the nature of awakened awareness. It's limitless, absolutely huge, limitless awareness, and it's very alert and awake. And the other, so it's like what you'd expect. There's no surprises here. Awake means awake. And the other important finding was that the activation of that parietal region as a region of interest also showed 45 to 65 hertz gamma activity for all 29 subjects, which is a very rare finding. So it means that what awakening means is that you're activating a shift to a system that changes from local awareness to global awareness, and you're doing that with all the cells firing, and awake means awake. That area of the brain wakes up to its limitlessness and it's perfectly lucidly awake. And that's the main finding. So those are the 2 main findings. There was also some activation in the beta activity range of the insula, which has to do with body felt sense. And since the views are all anchored in the body, it makes a lot of sense, but it's not the main finding. Those are the main findings. Does that make it a little clearer? So we hit aces. That the Dalai Lama said we should take concepts of Buddhism and put them to a scientific test. I thought that we should study something like the main confluence of the teachings, which is the experience of awakening. We did. It passed the test. Awake means awake, and it means shifting out of localized ordinary mind to absolutely limitless, huge, brilliantly alert, awakened awareness and its vividness. And that's if you think about, well, if you set up the view of lion's gaze, which is looking at the limitlessness of awareness and turning the awareness back on itself, that in that holding that view, there are 2 pathways of recognize. You have to use your metacognition to recognize the shift out of ordinary mind to awakened mind. And there are 2 pathways of recognition. One is non-localization. At some point you may notice that you're no longer operating out of localized individual consciousness, but operating out of being the unbounded wholeness. A place that is no place, has no location and no reference point. So we say that the infinite of individual consciousness, localized individual consciousness, merges with the infinitely vast mother consciousness of awakened Dhammakaya space. So what is being described there is very precise. It's the dropping away of localization of consciousness. And you are the unbounded wholeness at that point. That's your basis of operation. Or the other shift is that you shift out of ordinary dull awareness, ordinary awareness, to awakened awareness, which is bright and awake and alert. We call that the pathway of recognition through lucidity. And there are certain descriptors of awakened awareness that make it distinct from ordinary awareness. Awakened awareness has dangpa, brightness. It has nar, intensity. It has hrige, awakeness. It has dampa, sacredness. It has trole, sparkling immediacy. It has bole, softness. And as long as you don't make those qualities into specific things, so you're staying with the wholeness, and don't make them into states that you're looking for, then they can become guidelines for recognizing the difference between ordinary awareness and awakened awareness. And the The non-localization pathway is illustrated by the shift from local to global awareness in the parietal system. And the intensity of that is that lucidity pathway. It's not ordinary awareness. It's different. So we were very happy that the findings were very precise, and they're highly consistent with what we expect from all the descriptions of awakened awareness and all the pith instructions to point out how to do it. And we have some scientific validation for the nature of awakened mind now. The debate that we had following that, which I don't agree with, is some of the scientists want to now develop a biofeedback technology to teach people how to shift from local to global awareness, and I think that misses the whole point of the heart essence of the pith instructions. So before we did this project, I volunteered myself as a subject and told them what regions of interest to look for. And it was spot on. I thought it was going to be the ACC and the parietal system. So, but then after I shifted from local to awakening and had to shift in the localization part of the parietal system and told them that that's what they would find, they wanted me to do biofeedback to see if they could activate that part of the parietal system. And I said, I'll try it. So I did it for 15 minutes, and it keeps getting you locked back into particularizing mind. So it actually was interfering with the awakening, which was easy to establish without it. But I reminded Judd of a study that was done in the 70s, if people read back that far, in the beginnings of the biofeedback field. And when new technology comes out, of course, the excitement is to give it to everybody. But what people began to find is that biofeedback didn't work as well for everybody. And the fact that people who had talent for hypnosis, high hypnotizables, actually did worse with feedback. They could do it better by making natural mind-body connections without the feedback. And if you gave them the machines, they actually performed worse. If you took the machines away from them, they actually did it almost immediately to make the mind-body connections that were necessary. And I said, it's probably going to be something like that again with neurofeedback, not biofeedback. You're going to find that some people who have natural capacity, if you give them the feedback, it's going to interfere with what they can do on their own. So don't undermine their natural trust and confidence in what they can do. But for those who can't do it, and particularly those who are over-conceptualized, for those people, maybe the feedback will work. So we agreed to disagree, and we agreed that maybe for some individuals, the biofeedback might be useful, but it's not going to be a panacea and work for everybody, and actually might interfere and cause harm for some people. So, but I said that they wanted to try it, they could do it. So we had some subjects who, and we ran the original pilot data, who were more conceptual, and John and I didn't rate them high enough, but they wanted to be subjects, and we used them for the biofeedback part of it, and it helped. So I think the outcome is likely to be, in the second phase of the research, biofeedback will help for people who can't quite get it in a natural way, and maybe it will be a useful aid for that people, but it's not going to be a technology that's going to be working for everybody. However, if we think about testing the heart essence of these traditions, one thing we'd want to test is what? Awakened awareness, right? It's the confluence of all the teachings. If we went further along the path, what we want to test? What? Okay, well, we could test enlightenment, but we could test something a little short of enlightenment. And when Mahayana Buddhism was in India, the nature of the realization was called, the person who had that realization was called a Buddha. And Buddha means realized one. When those teachings were transferred to Tibet, they didn't use the word Buddha, realized one. They translated it with a compound term in Tibetan, which is called Sangye. Sangwa means complete purification. Yewa means flourishing of all positive states. So just short of full enlightenment, which is the realization of ultimate reality, the threshold, the platform for enlightenment, not the enlightenment itself, but the platform of enlightenment, sort of like the platform for awakening is the natural state. The platform for enlightenment is Sangye, the complete purification of all negative states and the flourishing of all positive states. And the way you get there is through the practice of Rangnang Rangdrol, self-arising, self-liberating. You hold the inseparable view of the vast, infinite expanse of limitless awareness space. And the liveliness of whatever arises within that is liveliness of awakened awareness. So everything is the dance and show of awakened awareness arising within that expanse. You hold both views simultaneously. The expanse and the lively activity of awakened mind that expresses itself through that expanse. And whatever arises by holding that view, you don't engage. Mental engagement, when the mind goes towards something to make more of it, to process it further, or goes away from it to make less of it. And that process of mental engagement in Dzogchen, or Great Completion teachings, is what causes karmic impressions to form. As soon as you engage something that comes into the field of experience, you make a karmic memory trace. That gets stored in the storehouse mind, and over lifetimes there are millions and millions of karmic traces. So if you set up the practice of Rangnang Rangdrol, self-arising, self-liberating, you set up that view of the inseparable pair. You hold the view of the limitlessness of the expanse of awakened awareness space, and the liveliness of awakened awareness is everything. All thought is lively awakened awareness. All emotions, all sights, all sounds, all body sensations, it's all lively awakened awareness. And you hold that simultaneous view, and you don't engage anything. You just watch the show without a watcher. And whenever something arises and goes its own course and just disappears, leaving no trace. So you set it up in just the right way. It takes a while to get the view just right. It's not a strategy. You can't engage the mind to not mentally engage. It has to be part of the view. But if you understand that and you get it right, it becomes an automatic process. Whatever arises within that limitless expanse immediately liberates itself, leaving no trace the next moment. So what happens is that if you set up the view with no mental engagement correctly, or what's called leave it aloneness, you stop forming any new karmic memory traces. And it forces the mind to rapidly release all previous storehouse karmic memory traces at a rapidly accelerated rate. If you do that practice automatically 24/7, and the average of 6 or 7 years, you've cleaned out the storehouse of lifetimes of karmic memory traces. The experience over time is that your field of experience gets called dreame, which often translated as stainless, but I don't like that term. I like to translate it as clean. Your field of experience gets cleaner and cleaner because it's more and more absent of negative states. And the negative states mask the positive states. So what happens after a while is the flourishing of positive states and there are no negative states left. We call that process Dhamma exhaustion. You exhaust all karmic memory traces, negative. So there's no negative states of mind anymore. It's all positive. Only positive states. And there are 80 positive states of a Buddha mind. Imagine the implications of this for mental health. No negative states left for the rest of your life, and only positive states. It's profound. Well, we have people who are getting into that range now. We can study them. And that would be the platform for enlightenment. Why don't we study the neurocircuitry of that? And so, in the follow-up to this study on awakening, because they were pleased with the results, I suggested that they study Rangnang Rangdrol and Sangye, the complete eradication of negative states and the flourishing of all positive states. We looked at that almost 40 years ago now. We gave Rorschach ink blots to people at various stages of meditation. And people who, Jack Engel and I did that back in the 1970s. And people who were not meditators, when they looked at the Rorschach, they had content. They saw bats and butterflies and people. When they were deeply concentrated and they stopped thought elaboration, they saw ink. They didn't make it into anything. They just saw the ink, and they talked about the shading and the shapes and the color of the ink, but they didn't make it into anything consistent with the winding down of thought elaboration. When they were in ocean and waves practice, we had to stop the Rorschach at 10 hours because they had infinite content. Because it's the simultaneous mind where everything exists within that cosmic database simultaneously. If we gave it to them the next day, we got completely different content, which is unusual. When we gave it to people who had a taste of awakening, but not very stable, the Rorschachs looked like ordinary Rorschachs again. The only difference was when we scored the Rorschachs for defense effectiveness and defense demand using their whole system, which is a tedious scoring system. We found that whatever conflicts they had were right out there. There was no reactivity. And that's consistent with what the tradition says, that what drops away is this reactivity of the mind going towards something that it likes and going away from what it dislikes. It's just there. You don't do anything to it anymore. It's consistent with this dropping off of some degree of mental engagement. But we found quite a disturbing finding that some of the people who had realizations of awakening had, from a clinical standards, would meet the Western personality disorder diagnosis standard. So they might be less reactive and suffer less, but their behavior would certainly make other people suffer. And that helped us understand the guru game, that teachers can come over here, they can have a legitimate sense of awakening, however unstable it may be, and they haven't changed the personality substrate of their mind at all. So they still engage in power and greed and money and self-importance and sexual misconduct and all these other wonderful things that gurus tend to do when they come to the West, to exploit Western students. And none of that changed the substrate of their personality. But then we had a smaller group, of course, that had Sangye, complete purification, and the flourishing of all positive states. And those Rorschachs were like nothing we've ever seen before. They were absent of all negative states, especially aggression-related states. And everything was positive. And what was memorable wasn't the content of the Rorschach, but the people we gave them to. They were the great saints and masters of this tradition, and they were the most present, loving people I've ever met. So now we want to revisit this issue of Sangye, complete purification and flourishing of positive states, in terms of its neurocircuitry. And I have some hypotheses of what we're going to find. The positive emotion center of the brain is the medial prefrontal cortex. It's also the pro-social behavior center of the brain. There was a subject study of Matthew Ricard, who was in his 20s, was a French molecular biologist who left molecular biology to become a monk in the Gelugpa tradition under the Dalai Lama. And for the last 30 years, he's practiced mostly compassion meditations. And Richie Davison brought him into his lab to test him before and after studying, visualizing compassion. And he showed very strong activation of the medial OFC, the medial orbital frontal cortex, which makes sense because it's the positive emotion center of the brain, and it's the pro-social behavior center of the brain, which means compassion and sensitivity to others' suffering in a positive way. So what we would expect is that if we had subjects who had achieved complete purification or something close to that, and flourishing of positive states, we'd expect to see strong gamma activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, and probably strong deactivation of the fear system, which is the amygdala, and strong deactivation of the negative emotion center, which is the limbic system. That's the working hypothesis. So I suggested that to Bruce Fessler and to Judd Brewer and to the National Science Advisor for this project, who's a straight scientist who was very excited by our results. He has no experience in meditation. He said, this is amazing stuff. What he liked the most is the precision of the meditations. You can actually get the mind states that refined, and it's not schlock. It's very precise what people are accomplishing. So we agreed as a group that I would, with John, see if we can identify enough students who are far enough along. Nobody's got the complete mastery of Dhammadhatu exhaustion yet, but we have enough people who've cleaned up their mind of negative states sufficiently that we can probably get a good measure on this. And they agreed to fund it. So if we get the neurocircuitry of awakening, the neurocircuitry of Sangye, and eventually the neurocircuitry of enlightenment, then I think I left behind something useful here to Western science before I leave my form body. So that's the goal. We found some other interesting things that should be worth mentioning, because in Buddhism, as you know, there's a difference between what we call the first, the second, and the third turning of the wheel. The first turning of the wheel is the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni. The second is Mahayana Buddhism, and the third is the essence traditions like Dzogchen, Great Completion, Mahamudra, Great Seal, and Tantra practice. And I like to see these three turnings of the wheel as something analogous to the structure of scientific revolutions in the West. When we have anomalies, after a while, there's a whole paradigm shift that occurs in science to explain those anomalies, and we consider that generally an improvement in science. So, for example, we used to think in the days of Ptolemy that the sun and the other planets revolved around the Earth. And then when the technology of making telescopes developed enough, there were enough anomalies that it didn't seem to explain that accurately anymore. And what came about was the Copernican revolution. We began to see through improved technology of telescopes that it's more likely that the planets, the other planets, and the Earth all revolved around the sun. That was a better explanatory model, and that was considered an improvement over the inaccurate previous model. I like to think about those three turnings of the wheel as scientific revolutions. And the reason why I have to mention that is because mindfulness meditation is very popular in the West. There are, as of 2010, there were 710 peer-reviewed articles on mindfulness-based therapy for one thing or another. It's remarkable. But the trouble with its popularity is the teachings get watered down and we lose the heart essence. It's not about mindfulness as a technique. It's about the heart essence. How many mindfulness teachers ever talk about awakening? We've lost the heart of this. And secondly, mindfulness, Burmese mindfulness, represents the first turning of the wheel. And it doesn't include any of the what I would consider great improvements and discoveries within Buddhism. I have students of mine who were mindfulness teachers from 30, 40 years ago, and 30, 40 years later, they're still talking about everything is suffering. That's not what it's about, folks. It's not all about suffering. The later Buddhism moved way beyond that. So here are the main things of the first three turnings of the wheel. The first is that the first turning of the wheel was the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni. And when he got enlightened on the Bodhi tree, he walked to the next town, Sarnath. He gave his first teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth was the truth of dukkha in Pali, which has often been mistranslated as the truth of suffering. The correct translation for the term dukkha means reactivity. And what Buddha was trying to say is that if you observe your mind in every moment of experience, if you like something, the mind moves towards it to make more of it. If you don't like it, it moves away from it to make less of it. So it's constantly, incessantly reactive to that experience. That's dukkha. If you translate it as suffering, which is the outcome of that reactivity, you miss the method. And that falls short of what Buddha intended, because he was trying to say, look, you can observe your own mind to see this and change it. And if you just take it as suffering, you lose the method. And in that first turning of the wheel, there are three things you observed. First was reactivity, dukkha. The second was impermanence, everything changes, nothing stays the same. And the third was more problematic, it was called anatta, or no self. And what it meant was something very specific. If you get deeply concentrated, thought elaboration drops away. So you have long periods of stillness, absence of thought. And after a while, thought elaboration winds down and pretty much stops. So you have long periods where there's no thought activity. So where are you operating out of? You're operating out of awareness, not operating out of thought. But if you keep concentrating, sometimes not only thought elaboration winds down and stops, but sense of self temporarily gets deconstructed. So you're sitting there meditating, and in my case, Dan's doing the meditation, and then Dan drops away. So who's doing the meditation at that point? Awareness is doing it. Probably awareness is going to do a better job than Dan. And that experience of the temporary deconstruction of the self-representation, in my case, Dan-ness, that is called anatta. Now, what ensued was a 500-year debate. And in that debate, some people began to say that to expect the self to drop away is nihilistic, like we're trying to get rid of the self. And that becomes a negative practice. Certainly reminds me of the first Monty Python movie where where the Catholic monks have wooden Bibles and they're taking 3 steps and chanting and then whacking themselves over the head with the Bibles, and taking 3 more steps and chanting and whacking themselves over the head of the Bible. They keep whacking themselves over the head with the wooden Bibles, punishing themselves, because self-representation is a bad thing. We got to get rid of it. And a similar debate went on in Buddhism. And finally, what came out 500 years later by Nagarjuna was something quite different. And what came out was, we're not getting rid of the self. But you're seeing it as just the way it really is, as a mere representation. And what came out was the theory of emptiness, which is an unfortunate term. And what emptiness really means is merely construction of mind. It's very similar to Western constructivist psychology. That everything the mind does, the ordinary mind does, is to make representations, models for the world. Sense of self is a construction. Out there-ness is a construction. Sight and sound is a construction. You're not hearing a sound out there. You're hearing your own representation of that sound. You're not seeing anything out there. You're seeing your own representations of out there. You're not thinking anything. You're thinking your own constructions. Everything is a construction of mind. Sense of self is a construction. So Western child developments tell us that children aren't born with a psychological sense of self. I didn't come into the world with damnness, although I think I did. The psychological sense of self develops between 12 and 20 months, peaking at about 18 months. And out of that, and it's concurrent with the capacity to develop representational thinking. So out of that comes this sense of self, damnness. And that's useful in everyday life. It serves as a central organizing principle. I organize my daily life around damnness, unfortunately. But it's useful. It's a central organizing principle in everyday life. There's nothing wrong with that. But here's where Buddhism is different. What Buddhism says is, if it's merely a construction of mind, we make the epistemological mistake after a while, when we operate out of self a lot, of thinking that it's out there and it's independently existing. I actually think that Dan exists independently, and I take him way too seriously. I forget that he's merely a construction of mind. And once I get, if I make that construction and then make a mistake, I make that self all too real. The Tibetan word is nojin. Grasping it is too real. It's very similar to the Western term reification. I reify it. I take it as independently self-existing. What I fail to see is that in relative reality exists because of the causes and conditions, not the least of which is the mind's capacity to represent. That's why I make a sense of self. But I fail to see it as just a construction. That's where I make the mistake. And if I don't see it correctly, there are 2 problems. One is grab, zinpa. The self has a lot of grab. And that's the difference in Mahayana Buddhism between explaining suffering. In the first turning of the wheel, suffering is the mind moves towards what it likes to make more of it, moves away from what it doesn't like to make less of it. Now in Mahayana Buddhism, they say that's all well and good, but what makes the mind move towards and makes the mind move again is the sense of self. So suffering is the suffering of self-grab. And that's pretty much consistent with modern Western research on mind wandering. Most people spend 47% of their day in mind wandering mode. And all mind wandering, if you look at the content of it, is about the self. It's making the self important in one way or another. Or maintaining this tiresome project of self, as the Hafiz, the Sufi poet once said. And the more you spend time dwelling on the fantasies of self, the more negative it gets. For most people, in terms of the research on mind wandering. So it's not a good thing. But it serves as a organizing principle in everyday reality, in relative reality. But ultimately, it's just an empty construction. And the second trouble is munpa. We get caught up in it. It clouds over our real nature. So I get this field of awareness, I get mixed up with self. I think the sense of self and the field of awareness are the same thing. If I do emptiness meditation, I see into the fact, I go beyond that as just a construction of mind, and I see it as just an empty construction. And I shift my basis of operation, so I'm not operating out of damnness, I learn in emptiness practice to shift out of operating out of Dan-ness to operating out of the field of awareness. Then I can go back to the meditation. The awareness is going to do a better job than Dan's going to do. Dan doesn't teach. Awakened awareness teaches. I just get out of the way. But that doesn't mean Dan doesn't exist. So that's a considerable improvement, because what it means is you go beyond the self. The word insight meditation in Tibetan Buddhism is laktung. Tongwa means to see. Lak means beyond it. It doesn't mean insight meditation. It means seeing beyond the obvious structures of mind to the deeper nature of awareness and learning to operate out of that. That's a huge improvement over no self, because you're not getting rid of anything. You're seeing beyond it. And that should be a reassurance that you're not going to get rid of the self, because it's useful in everyday life, in ordinary reality. I remember my first clinical placement in 1972 at Michael Reese Hospital. It doesn't exist anymore, in Southside Chicago. And the head of my department was Roy Grinker. He was old enough to tell me a story of his personal analysis with Sigmund Freud. And Freud didn't do these 20-year analyses like Woody Allen did. He mostly pushed people, and he got them better in 2 or 3 months before he had his couch. And he was pushing Roy, and Roy was afraid of changing too rapidly. And at one point, Freud didn't have the couch, and he leaned over the chair, and he whispered into Roy's ear. He said, "Roy, when you finish your analysis, your friends will probably still recognize you. When you do emptiness of self, your friends will probably still recognize you." And most masters, accomplished, realized masters, have rather strong personalities, because they don't get rid of the self. It's just not where they're operating out of. It's like a bubble in the ocean, but it's better to be the ocean. So, that said, there's a huge difference between the first turning of the wheel, which is no self, and all is suffering, and the second turning of the wheel, which is not all suffering. There's not all getting rid of the self, but relativizing the self and not operating out of it, seeing it as just a mere construction and going beyond it to the deeper level of awareness. There's no concept of levels of awareness in mindfulness meditation. But in Mahayana practice, you learn to go up to different levels of awareness, and you know that, as for those who took the course, as all illustrated in the Heart Sutra mantra. Gate, gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisvaha. Literally means, from Sanskrit, gone, gone, gone way beyond, gone way, way beyond. Ooh, what a realization. What does it mean? We mix up thought and awareness. We think it's the same thing. If you concentrate the mind down, thought elaboration stops. You get long periods of stillness. Well, where are you operating out of if there's no more thought? It begs the question. You see in your direct experience that you're operating out of the field of awareness rather than thought. Awareness gone beyond thought, the first gate. But still, that awareness is mixed up with self. If you do emptiness practice, you go beyond self to a field of awareness. It's no longer mixed up with self. So I'm not operating out of Dan-ness. I'm operating out of the field of awareness itself as my basis for the meditation. That's the second gate. Awareness itself gone beyond self-representation. Still, that awareness is caught up in coming and going in conventional time. If I go beyond conventional time, I go to ocean light, changeless, boundless awareness. That's a much bigger shift. That's called going way beyond paragate to ocean light, changeless, boundless awareness. Still, that awareness is caught up in localization of my individual consciousness and my information processing system. And with the lion's gaze and other crossing over instructions, I learn how to shift the perspective, step out of localization into becoming the unbounded wholeness as my basis. That's a much bigger shift. Gone parasamgate, gone way, way beyond the localization of consciousness. Ooh, what a realization to capture the metacognitive recognition of that shift. The reason why the Heart Sutra mantra is so popular, because the whole path is right there. And all has to do with shifting from one level to awareness to the other. And emptiness is the pathway that allows you to clear away the clouds of the mind, so there's no clouds anymore. So the radiance of awakened mind is always right here. Simple. Now, we found that in the studies of neurocircuitry of mindfulness and the studies of what we did in Mahamudra, in terms of the sense of self, it's quite different. So, for example, in mindfulness meditation, in Burmese mindfulness meditation, which represents the first turning of the wheel and the truth of anatta, no self, There are 5 studies on neurocircuitry that shows a deactivation of the medial prefrontal cortex, which is sense of self representation, Dan-ness in my case. Like the teachings promulgate, you actually deactivate your sense of self. I'm not sure that's a good thing. Jack Engel and I found in the 70s when 3-month Burmese mindfulness retreats were first getting popular at a center called IMS in Barre, Massachusetts. The first 120 people would take a 3-month course on a regular basis, and we did outcome studies on them for 10 years. We found a lot of kids who had significant self-pathology from a clinical perspective were hearing the language of no self and say, finally somebody understands me. They would take these silent retreats where they'd interacted with no one, get all sorts of shifting states, get disorganized psychologically, have lots of transference reactions, and play out all sorts of things with the teachers, and it was a disaster. They were regressing too much. And they needed to be pulled from the retreats and getting into a good treatment that would allow them to develop a strong sense of self, not to get weak in the self. So we actually recommended that the mindfulness teachers set up a referral service for people and pull them from the retreats, which they listened to. Whereas Jack Engel once said, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. You have to develop a sense of self in the relative sense before you can go beyond it. You certainly don't want to try and get rid of it. I remember seeing a kid in his he was 29 at the time. He had done 10 years of long rounding with TM. He had a psychotic depression. He said, I spent 10 years avoiding developing a sense of myself through meditation. I used meditation in the service of defense, and now I have to go back and spend 10 years rebuilding something I wasted all this time. And he was right. So the language of anatta is not something that I strongly support, although it's one of the languagings of the popularity of Burmese Buddhism, the first turning of the wheel. I think the emptiness practice is a much more improvement over how we deal with the issue of self, and it was shown in the neurocircuitry study, because the sense of self, the medial prefrontal cortex, in our study with our Mudra subjects did not get deactivated. The medial prefrontal cortex stayed activated and stayed online, but that's not where they were operating out of. They were operating out of the parietal system, out of global awareness. The sense of self was like a bubble within the ocean, but better to be the ocean. So the actual studies on what happens to psychological sense of self make a lot of sense to us. But to go back and say, is a lot of the people of mindfulness who don't know anything about the history of Buddhism try and say that, this is the authoritative teachings of the Buddha, so therefore it's the only truth. That's like saying we should go back to Ptolemus because Copernicus was wrong, because Ptolemus was in the idea that all the planets revolved around the Earth was correct because it was the authoritative view, because it was the first view. It's not logical, folks. We take things from other cultures and we say, okay, this is the truth because it was taught by the original Buddha. Well, what about the improvements that came after that? We're going to negate all that stuff? Doesn't make any sense from a scientific point of view. So I tend to think that the theory of emptiness and going beyond self but not getting rid of it was a significant improvement. And this idea that there are different levels of awareness that you shift to, gate, paragate, parasamgate. Shift out of the thought to awareness, shift out of self to awareness itself, shift out of time to ocean light changeless boundless awareness, shift out of that and out of the localization of that into individual, into the unbounded, being the unbounded wholeness. Ooh, you got it. What a realization. It's as simple as that, folks. It's not even hard to do with the right instructions. And what's exciting is to see that the scientific validates exactly what we'd expect, knowing how the brain works and the regions of interest in the brain, and knowing how Buddhism works. So now we'll continue to see if we can get some neurocircuitry markers for Sangye, for no negative states, all positive states. Because in my point of view, as a clinician, that has profound implications for mental health. We're not even beginning to think about that. And we should. So the other thing, which is we're not quite finished yet, one more thing I'll say about this. We did another paper. Andrea Ruff, who is a postdoc in Judge Lab from Brazil, did a paper on neurophenomenology. So she took our 29 subjects and had the computer do an analysis of the consistency of their language of how they describe these states, because they had 5 minutes to describe ocean and waves, 5 minutes to describe natural state, 5 minutes to describe lion's gaze, and 5 minutes to describe stable awakening. And she had the computer analyze what they came up with. And what was really nice is the descriptions that the subjects came up with are not all over the place. They're highly consistent with what the texts say. The only thing that was missing was that when in the lion's gaze, there are 2 conditions to recognize awakening. One is the pathway of non-localization, and the other is the pathway of clarity or lucidity. But before you set up that, you have to set up the natural state as the foundation for that. And there are 2 features of the natural state that are very important, because you can't shift from partialized mode to unbounded wholeness. You can't grasp the unbounded wholeness from a partialized stance. So any kind of directed attention is partialized. So you have to move beyond doing anything. You have to move from doing to non-doing. It takes a lot of work to get to the stage of non-doing. And automatic emptiness is what sets up this non-doing. And the second was beyond all conceptualization. If you can't, conceptualization partializes. If it's about this concept is not about that concept. All conceptualization by definition is partialized. So you can't think your way into awakening. You can only see all thought as automatically empty, and it clears away. So you move to what's called the fresh mind, clear of all conceptualization, and you move beyond all doing. The only thing that didn't come out in the findings was that there wasn't enough data to signify. The non-conceptual piece came up, but the non-doing piece didn't come out clearly. So I said, you gotta go back and look at this because it's really important. And she did, and she found that they described it in different ways in our conventional language, but there's enough data there that we reanalyzed that we found what we were looking for. So most of the concepts of why the languaging is so important turns out to work. And what our subjects demonstrated was pretty much close to what we expected to find based on what the authoritative texts and the secret pith instructions say about how to do this. So I'm happy with the findings. They're good findings. And that's what we found. Does that make it a little clearer? It's profound. We struck aces with it. Well, it depends on what audience we're looking at. The neurocircuitry article will appeal more to our subjects and people in the Dharma world. The neurocircuitry article will appear less, but it gives a certain validation. But from a scientific audience who knows nothing about this, we had at the foundation meeting when we went over the results, we had an independent advisor in the National Science Foundation. And he was very impressed with the results. He was really excited about it. And he actually gave us a blessing to go ahead and do the Sangha study now, even though this is completely alien to him. He said, you're doing something right. So I think what it does is it's going to open eyes in the scientific community about this Gemra activity, because it's just does not seen something. You can see it every now and then in a subject, but it means all the cells are being activated in a synchronized way. That's not something the brain normally does. So it's a unique and very rare finding, and it's consistent with what we'd expect with awakened mind. It's not that the whole brain turns itself on. It's only certain regions, but those regions are very alert and awake. Awake means awake. So that finding is worth the paper just the way it is, because it's not something. It's a unique finding. It's not something that's been seen before. Any other questions about the study, Kathy? Let's wait.
As with other scientific papers, and this is very scientific, is it going to have to be replicated? And if so, is that in process, or is there going to be a need to replicate the study?
Well, they're going to replicate it they have a new, more efficient 36-channel EEG, which should do the same resolution as the 128. So we thought of running the same subjects if we were willing to do it. Some of that people here in this room do it again with a more efficient technology. So the answer to that is yes. There are three things that are planned. One is replicating it with more streamlined technology. The second is this biofeedback thing, which I'm skeptical of. And the third is the Sangha, the self-arising, self-liberating, and the complete purification of negative states and the flourishing of positive states. Those are the things that we're planning. We thought, I wanted to do a functional MRI because it's better resolution. We did the 128 channel EEG because you get real time. A person can say, I just shifted my basis to awakening. And we could mark what the computer's picking up on in terms of the regions of interest of the Neuros-Circuits of the brain at that point. But the subjects were so talented in being able to shift that state, then we don't need it. So, for example, the skill of what in Buddhism we have this notion called shinchang, or mental pliancy. It's a certain resultant skill. Whatever the mind does and intends to do, it does only that with nothing interfering with it. It just does it with lightning speed. That's an outcome of all this practice. I found that when I played with it as a volunteer subject myself the first time, because when I shifted to natural state with automatic emptiness, what came up was deactivation of the posterior cingulate cortex. Now, in mindfulness, there are 5 studies that consistently show, mostly out of Judd's lab, but some other labs, that the main finding in mindfulness is the deactivation of the PCC, the other half of the cingulate system. And that's the part of the mind that categorizes and judges. So when people are taught Buddhist Burmese mindfulness and saying non-judgmental awareness, that instruction is partially shutting down the categorizing and propensity to judge and provide labels to all experience. Interesting enough, there are 2 studies on psilocybin use, and both showed deactivation of the PCC. So when you're sitting there and everything is equally as interesting and there's no preference and you're saying, far out, man. Not that I've ever done anything like that. You know what I'm talking about. It's the same state. You're deactivating the judgmental part of the mind and just having pure non-judgmental awareness, which is exactly how secular Burmese mindfulness is taught in the West since Johnny Kabat-Zinn's book years ago. But we found in non-meditation meditation, which is another name for the natural state, deactivation of the PCC also. The difference was the magnitude. It was stable and it lasted. So when I shifted on myself as a subject to non-meditation meditation, I had one thought in 10 minutes. It took me exactly 2 seconds in clock time to shift to that state, and it remained stable. And there was a high magnitude of deactivation for 10 minutes. It was completely stable. That resolution of using certain neurocircuits is what's important with skilled subjects. It's like somebody who's working out on a machine and is a skilled exerciser. So they're doing a new routine on the Pilates machine. They only isolate the muscles for that exercise because they're skilled. And somebody who's not experienced uses a lot of other muscle groups until they learn to isolate those out. The brain does the same thing. Very skilled meditators just isolate out what circuits they're going to use for that task at hand. They don't use all the other circuits. It's not a schlock. We found that years ago when we brought a tachistoscope, a high-speed electronic board, to study the speed of the mind in meditators at Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama gave us his best concentrators. And we call out different meditation states, and the average time to shift into that in a stable state was 2 seconds, like shifting gears in a car. I experienced that when I was in Burma in the 1970s. Because the final exam, when I was going through the stages of the practice, were they'd call out the stages randomly and you had to produce them on the spot out of order. And they would tell by the skill and pliancy of how you did that whether you really got the realization. Because you should be able to do anything at will. Just the mind intends that you got it. So that's what I found when I played with it myself in the lab. But then I said, I'm not the only person who can do this. All my subjects who are really good can do this. And then they brought in about 5 pilot subjects, and they all did the same thing I did. So no special skill here. They just were good meditators. But the PCC deactivation is consistent in non-meditation meditation, but in my experience, non-meditation meditation does a better job with it from a neurocircuitry point of view than mindfulness. Mindfulness is a mixture of different techniques. It's not as precise. This precision is like nothing else, as you know. It works. Yeah, David?
During the study, when the people were describing, making the descriptions in between, they still had the stuff on. Did the brain go back to just normal activity, or I mean, obviously it didn't stay in those states.
I don't know how to answer that. I don't think I looked at that.
Oh, okay. So I'd be curious if it went all the way back.
I'm sure the data's there. I don't think we looked at that.
Okay.
You got a massive data set. You usually look in the regions of interest. That's why I pilot on myself first, and I know enough neuroscience to say this is the areas we're going to look at, because these are more likely to get a good yield. Otherwise, you're just doing thousands of correlations, and statistically, the correlations are, some of them are just not valid because you're doing too many correlations, and you come up with stuff that isn't real.
Yeah, I guess just my own curiosity as you were describing it.
Don't know. Okay. I'm sure the data's there. I just don't know how to answer it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Wait. You got to get the.
I was wondering if you measured any other physiological variables, or if you have a sense of what the effect on the total body is, or the rest of the body.
Well, we had an effect on the insula. It activated the insula, which is body self-awareness. So the realizations are very much anchored in the body. That's my interpretation of that.
And when you were trying to describe awakened awareness to scientists that had never thought about it before, did you have a sort? How did you describe that to people that would have no reason to think that that was an interesting thing to study?
I say it's the confluence of all the teachings. It's not about meditation techniques. It's about where the teachings bring you to. And there's an infinitely vast, brilliant field of awakened, lucid awakened awareness. It's always right here, but we don't recognize it because the mind's too clouded over. I use the Yasn's traditions, which is the third turning of the wheel, is two things. One is the underlying metaphor is the sun and clouds. It's raining outside, and then the clouds clear after a while. You say the sun just came out. Is that accurate? Of course not. The sun's always been out. But you can't see it from the perspective of the clouds. And the awakened mind is always right here. It's part of our Buddha nature, but we don't see it because it's clouded over by thought, clouded over by sense of self, it's clouded over by time, it's clouded over by the content of the mind, it's clouded over by the operations of our information processing system and localization of consciousness. And when you remove these clouds, after a while, there's no clouds left. You see the awakened mind like the sun is always here. You say, oh, it's always here. So that's the analogy I use to describe it.
And then quickly, if it's not a trade secret, if I understood correctly, did you say that you were verifying the experimental subject states by observing them yourself?
No, by description.
By their descriptions, not...
We interviewed them and we asked them to give us a description of their experience of ocean and waves, their description of the natural state. And we wrote it down and we rated it. John and I worked out rating scales. And we then, as one does with coding, you see how consistent the coding is. We were about 80% accurate of the coding, and then we had 3 subjects that we disagreed on. So we eliminated the subjects we couldn't disagree. And some of the subjects we were below 6. That was the cutting score. We came up with a cutting score. They had to have more than not the experience of ocean and waves, more than not the experience of the natural state, but not all the features of it. So there are 5 characteristics of the natural state. There's non-dual awareness, the automatic emptiness of everything that arises moment by moment in that field, fresh, free of conceptualization, simple without doing, and lucid. So if they gave us 3 or 4 of those characteristics, but not all 5 of them in the spontaneous report, then we'd score that about 7 or 8. They gave us almost all the characteristics. It pervaded the description. We give it 9 to 10. See how it works? So we spent a lot of time developing these rating scales. And that was good because John and I found that we were looking at most of the subjects similarly. And there were a couple of subjects that John and I struggled about. We thought the conceptualization was precluding the realization. They were just thinking their way through it and had the need to see it that way. And we both identified the same subjects we had doubts about. And pretty much like what we do when we talk about teaching. So, but we developed some rigorous coding scales for this. And it worked. And it helped us refine the teaching. So now we know more what to look for in the descriptions of these states. Yeah.
So when you were speaking about representations of mind and conceptualization,
Yeah.
I was just wondering, because I'm accustomed to thinking about what human beings as world constructing, insofar as that any particular thing we encounter is only possible within a world that we've constructed.
In
But
relative reality, that's true, but not ultimate reality.
I guess that was my question. Is there
The Buddhist logicians like Chandrakirti and Dignaga and others spend a lot of time laying an infrastructure to say that there are two modes of knowing. There's conceptual knowing, which is the heart of Buddhist logic, and there's direct experiential knowing through meditation practice, which comes from awareness, not thought. And we don't really make room for both of those modes of knowing in the West. We think it's all conceptual. It's a problem. Even if you look at the studies on mature adult cognitive development in the West, stages beyond formal operational thinking. People like Commons and Richards, which are the neo-Piagetians, will say, well, there's the idea of non-conceptual knowing, but they don't really take it seriously because they're locked in their paradigm. But you can move beyond all that, and you have to move beyond conceptual knowing. That's why the crossing over instructions are kept secret. Because if you disseminate them and people try and think their way through them and not having the natural state as the foundation, then they actually precludes awakening, hardens the mind, and actually makes it harder to experience awakening. So they're not given out until people have the foundation of pure awareness. So they're not thinking enough, and all thinking that comes up is immediately released is automatically empty. So they don't sort of harden the mind because it makes it harder to awaken at that point. So it's not like they're trying to keep them secret. They're trying to protect you from misusing them, because invariably a number of people are going to misuse them because they get greedy. We live in a society of spiritual greed. People want stuff. They want attainments. It doesn't work like that.
I guess so I was thinking of the constructions of world as empty of sort of in any kind of independent reality, but my
but
question,
useful in relative reality. They're still useful in relative reality. Enlightened masters still think. They just don't get caught up in the thought.
So world construction doesn't stop.
No, if you refine the emptiness of thought and you take it as far as you can go, it becomes one of the 5 wisdom energies. It's discriminating wisdom. It's Buddha can look with lightning laser-like speed with thought and know exactly what an individual needs because they see everything through that thought. It's like a smart target bomb. Every thought for a different individual just picks out exactly what's needed by that individual. So that's called discriminating wisdom. It's the ultimate refinement of thought. It becomes the tool for how Buddhists know how to use skillful means for different people and provide different teachings. You don't get rid of it. You just refine it until you use it in the right way. But you're not operating out of that. You're still operating out of a enlightened mind. So you're not caught up in thought. It's the capacity of the thought to cloud over is the real problem. So it's not an enemy. You just got to refine it and see it correctly, the way it is. But they're operating out of pure awareness. They're not operating out of thought. Thought just serves that purpose. That make it a little clearer?
Yes.
So why don't we take a break here and then we'll do practice. 10-minute break. So I can't illustrate awakening or complete purification of negative states and flourishing of positive states in the time frame that we have, but I can show you emptiness of self and ocean and waves practice, which is the foundation of this stuff, so you get a little taste of what I was talking about. So if you don't have any experience with emptiness practice, just listen and follow, let the mind follow what I'm describing. If you've done the course, you know this stuff. It should be second nature to you by now. So first we're going to do emptiness of self, and then we're going to do emptiness of time. So you're going to experience what's called awareness itself, and then timeless, boundless, ocean-like awareness. Then we're going to do a practice from Milarepa called ocean and waves. So all you have to do is follow what's being presented, but the emptiness of self, and it requires you to evoke your sense of self and search for it. And as humans, we have the capacity for self-reflective awareness. So if I say, bring to mind your sense of self, you can evoke your sense of self and observe it. So if I say, bring to mind your sense of self, personal identity, I can evoke the sense of damnness and get a general sense for damnness. Don't do damnness, do you? You follow what I'm saying? There you go. You're spatializing, David. Okay. Just follow the instructions. Bring to mind your usual sense of self, personal identity. Evoke it. Directly observe it. See if you can get a general sense of that personal identity. Identify character traits that you usually associate with that personal identity. But it's better to get a general sense of that personal identity. This way you familiarize yourself with the target for the search. And then take your high-speed awareness and roam around in the trunk of your body. Roaming everywhere in the trunk of your body. Searching for anything independently existing, anything solid about that self, anywhere in the trunk of your body. If you think you find it someplace, roam around more and break it down into smaller units of analysis. So, for example, if you think you find your sense of self in the heart, roam around in which chamber of the heart it's in. Go into the cells and the tissue structure. Go into the molecules, and at some point, what you seek as the target keeps slipping away as unfindable. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, the essential practice of emptiness meditation is yeme, in unfindability. You search for the thing as independently existing or as substantial, and wherever you search you can't find it, keeps slipping away. That's the experiential shift of unfindability we're looking for. And when you get that experiential shift of unfindability, look into the field of awareness. It's always right here. And what will open up is a level of awareness that's gone beyond self-representation. Awareness itself becomes your basis of operation, gone beyond personal identity. Emptiness as a self-meditation always has two parts. Searching until it's unfindable, and then affirming something new about the awareness that's cleaned up of that substantial, seemingly substantial structure of a mind. So now you're operating out of a pure field of awareness rather than operating out of, in my case, damnness. Using a good Tibetan metaphor, you're separating out the solid yak herds of self from the pure milk of awareness. Now evoke the sense of self once again. Get a general sense for that personal identity. So in my case, I would evoke damnness and get a general sense of damnness. Take your high-speed awareness and roam everywhere through your body, starting this time with your head, brain, roam around in the brain and see if you can find anything independently existing, anything solid about that sense of self, anything in itself that is that self, anywhere in the region of the brain. If you think you find it in the brain area, go right into that area and search the cells. Search the constituents of the cells, the molecules. And at some point, what you seek as the target keeps slipping away as unfindable. Then roam around the rest of the body, see if you can find anything independently existing about that self, anywhere in the body at all. You have to search with high-speed awareness. You can't think your way through this and slap a label on it conceptually. The more you search, the target you seek keeps slipping away as unfindable, and when you get that experiential shift of unfindability, look into the field of awareness that's right here, and what will open up is a level of awareness gone beyond self. No longer clouded over by that empty construction of personal identity. Establish awareness itself as your basis of operation. Basis of operation means that's where you're coming from. Not operating on a self mode, but operating on a pure awareness mode. Gone beyond self. Evoke the sense of self, personal identity once again. Familiarize yourself with the target for the search. Get a general sense of that personal identity, along with any specific characteristics, traits that you associate with that personal identity. Now, ease up and let mental content come up in your mind, like thoughts, emotions, sights, sounds, perceptions. And search through each and every specific mental event that comes up, seeing if you can locate an independently existing self, anything solid about that self, in any specific mental content. Can you find that personal identity existing as in a given thought, in an emotion, in a sight or a sound? If you think you find it, break it down into smaller units. If you think you find it in a specific thought, break it down into smaller thoughts. In a series of thoughts. You have to be in each one of those then. And as you keep doing that, it will keep slipping away as unfindable. So maybe it's not any specific mental content, but it's in all of the entirety of mental content. So hold all the entirety of mental content in your mind all at once, moment by moment by moment. And see if in the entirety of that content you can locate anything independently existing or solid about that self. And as you try moment by moment to hold the entirety of the content of mind, the target you see keeps slipping away as unfindable. And when you get that experiential shift, affirm awareness itself as your basis of operation. Gate. Awareness itself gone beyond getting caught up in personal identity or self mode as your basis of operation. Now open your eyes, look into the surrounding field of empty awareness, saturates everything. Mix your awareness into that space, in the empty space into your awareness, so it's one field of empty awareness space, saturating everything. A field of knowing awareness space. We say awareness is like space, but unlike space, it has the capacity to know things. We call that empty awareness space. Now keep looking at that empty awareness space and come to see that there's something about that field that never changes and doesn't come and go in conventional time. There's something about the field itself of empty awareness space, or the point of observation of the field, or both, that never changes. It goes beyond coming and going in conventional time. So as you keep staring into that empty awareness space, identify the changeless, timeless aspect of that field, always right here. completely changeless. The events within that field come and go in time, but the field itself doesn't change. So immediately perceive in the changeless aspect of that field. Now come to see that that field of empty awareness space extends in all directions. So it's not only changeless, but it's boundless and vast. Extend your field of awareness as vast as you can make it. But as you try and do that, you'll notice that the ordinary mind usually imposes constructions on this space. So see where you impose edges and boundaries on that space. And wherever the edges and boundaries are, take your awareness and move right into the edges and boundaries. Like pouring space into space. Open right into that area. Until the boundaries disappear like mist dissolving into the atmosphere. If they pop up somewhere else, more edges and boundaries, keep moving into them like pouring space into space. Open right into them. And keep doing this until not only is the space changeless, but it's absolutely limitless in all directions. Come to see what limitless awareness is like. Changeless and timeless on the one hand, limitless on the other hand. We call this setting up the view of ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness. Limitless, changeless awareness. Always right here. And as you continue to hold that view and make it your stable vantage point, come to see that your basis of operation is such that you're operating out of or being that ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness. That's where you're coming from, in other words. That where you're observing from is within that field of ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness, or being that ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness. So establish that as your basis of operation. Paragate. Ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness gone way beyond the coming and going in the convention of time. Now ease up and let the ordinary content of the mind come back. Thoughts, emotions, sights, sounds, etc., body sensations. But whatever arises is seen like a wave arising in an ocean. The difference is where you're coming from. You're coming from the vantage point of being that ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness, looking at its own waves. Like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness looking at its own waves. Hold the view absolutely stably. Don't fall out of the view. Hold the view of ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness, like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness looking at its own waves. Hold that view absolutely stably every moment. Where the view is unshakable as a mountain, where the meditation is wide and deep as the vastest of oceans. The view is the meditation. And whatever arises immediately as lively awareness, as emptiness. Whatever arises is seen as another empty construction of mind, the expression of lively awareness showing itself to itself. Nothing is solid. Nothing is independently existing. Like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness observing its own waves. Just as there are many types of variations of waves, sizes and shapes of waves, there are many types of mental content, but they all share the same feature of being emptiness, liveliness. Just there are many waves, but they all share the same feature of being waves. Whatever arises is just another wave of emptiness, liveliness. Like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness viewing its own waves. And whatever arises in that immense, limitless, empty awareness space arises with no grab whatsoever. And right here is your first taste of the path of spacious freedom. Within that immense spaciousness, nothing has any grab to it. And just as one wave after another arises, but they all share the same feature of being waves, after a while, there are no preferences. The great way to awakening is not difficult for those who have no preferences. Hold ocean light, changeless, boundless awareness stably as your view. Like an ocean, changeless, boundless awareness viewing its own waves. Don't hold the mind too tight. You need the content for the realization of emptiness. An ocean can't view its own waves if there are no waves. Allow the content to come up, but don't fall out of the view. Relax the mind enough for the content to come up, but don't fall out of the view of ocean light, changeless, boundless awareness. Like an ocean of changeless, boundless awareness viewing its own waves. And whatever arises is just another expression of emptiness, liveliness. Timeless, limitless field of awareness, within the field of which everything arises like waves arising in an ocean. Awareness showing itself to itself, manifesting as lively content, knowing itself through its own content, like an ocean viewing its own waves. Open the eyes again. View the empty surrounding awareness space. All the objects in that space, the sights, the sounds, the thoughts, the emotions, and the knowing of those objects is one single unified non-dual field, without any outside, without any inside. Establish the field of non-dual awareness. Now come to see where your basis of operation is. If you're operating out of some localized point within that field, looking at something also within the field, wherever the point you're looking from, just open into that as basic space. Move your awareness right into it. Open into it as basic space, like pouring space into space, until the point of observation dissolves like mist dissolving into the atmosphere. Until the field is one non-dual field and you're operating out of being that non-dual field, without localization within that field. Just as an ocean and its waves are not separable, the knowing field of awareness and the objects that arise as expressed awareness within that field is the same field of non-dual awareness. Like an ocean and its waves, like the sun and its rays, like the atmosphere and the breeze that arises in the atmosphere. Come to directly experience the non-dual aspect of this field without inside, without outside. Always right here. Awareness expressing itself to itself in the form of its own liveliness, knowing itself through its own expressions, non-dual. insubstantial yet vividly occurring as expressed lively awareness. The phenomena of the three realms of samsara, while not existing, they appear. How incredibly amazing. So we did 3 practices. The first was emptiness of self. You evoke the self as the target for the search. You search with high-speed awareness, not conceptual thought. It's too slow. And you roam around everywhere looking for something independently existing or substantial. And the more you look, it keeps slipping away as unfindable. And that's the first part. That's called the negation part of the search. Then when you get that experiential shift of unfindability, you keep slipping away. You look into the field of awareness, and what will open up is an awareness that's gone beyond whatever that solid structure of the mind is. So in this case, you open up a field of awareness that's no longer mixed up with, confounded by a sense of self. And you establish that as your stable basis of operation. So I'm no longer operating out of Dan mode or self mode. I'm operating out of the field of awareness. That field of awareness is probably going to do a better job with the meditation than Dan is. So that's emptiness of self. Emptiness of time. You got the direct instructions that's called the pointing out style by Sri Simha, who was Padmasambhava's teacher. And you come to see the constancy of the field, the part that doesn't come and go in time. There's something about the field of where you're looking from above that never changes. The events within the field come and go in time, but the field itself is timeless. So in that way, you directly move beyond time. You're not caught up in the coming and going of time. Then you go from time and space are related, so you go from that to the limitlessness of the field. So now you set up the view of ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness. You come to see that that's where your basis of operation is. That's where you're coming from. Then once you set up that view, you ease up and let the relative content of the mind come back. Thoughts, emotions, sights, sounds, like waves arising in an ocean. The difference is where you're viewing it from. You're not viewing it from self. You're not viewing it from thought. You're viewing it from ocean-like, changeless, boundless awareness, like an ocean viewing its own waves. That makes all the difference in the world. That's a much bigger shift that some of you, if you follow what I was doing, that's why it's marked linguistically paragate, gone way beyond the convention of time. Bigger shift. And then the last piece of that was a refinement of that called non-dual awareness. You see the field, the events in the field, and the knowing of the events is all same unified non-dual field, like a unidimensional field without inside, without outside. You follow that? The next stop is awakened awareness. There's one more stop in the bus tour. See, it's simple. It's all about shifting levels of awareness, cleaning out the clouds that get in the way of opening up those levels of awareness until there are no clouds. Or as the poet Rumi once said, it's not hard to find the door when there are no walls. Questions about what you just did? Observations, comments about your practice? Anybody? John?
I thought I heard something new in the non-dual instruction about searching for the location of like where you're coming from and opening into that. I don't think I've ever heard that before as an instruction.
It's one of the Chalwar instructions, the opening instructions.
For non-dual.
There are 3 types of Chalwar instructions. The first type of Chalwar instruction, or opening instruction, is the ordinary mind keeps imposing arbitrary boundaries and edges on that space. So you open up the space and then you see what's left, where the edges are. Maybe they're right here, maybe they're here, maybe they're the edge of Newton, maybe they're the edge of the universe. But wherever they are, you open right into them. It's just arbitrary constructions, and you're like pouring space into empty space. You're opening right into them with your awareness. and they disappear like mist dissolving in the atmosphere. Then you can dissolve the point of observation to make it non-dual, because you're looking from someplace at something in the field. But if you dissolve the point of observation in the field by opening right into that point of observation until it becomes part of the field, you collapse that distinction of duality. That's the second Chow instruction. There's the third, you get rid of the localization completely. And that's or sets up the conditions for awakening. It's all in the instructions. Just follow the instructions. It's not hard to do this. That's the nature of precious lineage tradition. It's not just sitting down and meditating. It's showing you what to do to transform your mind to awakening. So you're right. You were correct to say that you didn't get that before, because I don't usually give that out. It's for certain states of mind. But since they give you a quick crash course to non-dual awareness, it's a good foundation for the natural state. You get a little bit of what we were talking about. So the stuff that we were talking about isn't just abstract states anymore. It makes the idea is to make it real for you.
When I do the practice, there's a sense that I'm like fighting myself, like there's a force that's trying to reassert those boundaries. And like, what is that force?
Ordinary mind. And each time you dismantle the boundaries and they reassert themselves, each time you're dismantling more and more of the residuals of the ordinary mind. We call that dismantling, chikpa.
It's just conditioning. It's just
it's all karmic conditioning, and after a while, there's no boundaries anymore.
It's cool.
You stop coming up. You don't fall out of the view anymore. It's like any other kind of learning. It involves practice. You got to practice right. It's very specific, you see. Anybody else?
Well, actually, I had the same observation. I never heard you do that one in the 6.5 years I've ever the same thing, and that was really helpful. I just, as a point of emphasis, I thought
I got to throw
really
you a bone every now and then, you know.
But yeah, I felt that was just helpful to just go there and I'm disappeared and see myself.
Don't misuse it. They're very special instructions. Don't overuse them. Use them specifically for the point of observation. Don't use them for everything. It has a very specific use here.
Anyways, thank you.
It's okay? Clear enough? Okay. Thank you for the question. It was a good question. So I will be here next week. Hopefully. Going to the Patriots game. But I had to do that for the sake of all sentient beings. So go Pats. See you next week.